Hey, good afternoon. I'm Sister Grace. And today I'd like to talk to you about never giving up. Did you know? I know this isn't a popular subject, but it's a subject that needs to be talked about. Did you know that every 40 seconds someone commits suicide? That the leading cause of death for ages 10 to 34 is suicide. 54% of us have been affected somehow. Yet it's something nobody wants to talk about. Well, I'm here today to ask you, to encourage you to never give up. You know, we get ashamed in life of things. You know, it's like if we have cancer and we tell someone that we have cancer and we ask them to pray for us, people have sympathy. You know, we many of us have had someone that a family member or a friend that we've lost or have who have struggled with cancer, but there's no shame. We feel no shame in going up into saying I've got to go have chemo. Yeah, every 40 seconds someone is dying too early. Many of them as young as 10 years old or younger. Why? Because there's a stigmatization on being able to open up and say, I'm hurting. I'm hurting. Help me. Help me to survive. Now I'm going to share something, and I'm nervous about sharing this, but this is my truth. I don't have cancer, but I do struggle with depression. And I do have for many years a Christian woman who loves the Lord more than anything in all the world struggle with suicide ideation, serious depression. But yeah, and I'm not depressed today, so I'm not saying that. I'm saying that so if anyone out there is listening and they feel alone or they're judging themselves, oh Lord, please don't judge yourself. Like I said, I've been there. Not the last time I was there, but the last time I almost succeeded, my daughter saved me. My daughter, who was on the East Coast in Maine, and I was in Beverly Hills, and she didn't even know where I was, tracked my phone and saved my life, or I wouldn't be here speaking today. I want to show you something. And then I want to explain something to you also. See this here? This is Joyce Myers, a very famous preacher who our life in many ways emulates one another. Not our current life, but our childhoods. And Joyce wrote this book, Never Give Up. Now, I was in Goodwill, and like I said, I struggle. And a lot of times depression also, it's something that we pass on. It can be hereditary. My father, my biological father had always suffered with depression. Well, anyhow, I go into Goodwill and I buy this book. I open it up. It's given to someone who had harmed me in my childhood by their best friend to help them to never give up. No, I don't need to get into whose book it was. You'll have to read my book, Nobody's Daughter, to know who this book was. Because this video isn't about, I don't know, sharing dirty laundry or pain or all that. Well, it's about saying to never give up. I want to share a little story with you about someone who had every single reason to give up, yet she didn't give up. Many of you who've never even spent more than a day, more than Christmas Eve at church, know about the story of the woman at the well, the Samaritan woman in John 4. Now, in John 4, the woman at the well, it will tell you that Jesus was in Galilee and he had to go to Samaria. Now, I'm sorry. He had to go to Jerusalem and on the way, he stopped through Samaria at a place called Sychar. Now, Sychar was a place that any decent, self-respecting Jew didn't go to because it was a place that was considered of drunkenness and darkness and drunkenness. But Jesus had an appointment there. He had to meet the woman at the well. So he had to go there. And before he left there, it says in John 4 that the Pharisees, how'd it go? The Pharisees heard, which refers to gossip, that Jesus was baptizing more disciples than John, when in fact, Jesus had not baptized any disciples. And this isn't that important, but it's sort of it's. And Jesus learned. The only reason I mention that is to explain what it's saying there. The Pharisees heard Satan is the ruler of the air. So be careful of what you're listening to. Be careful of what you're taking in and taking as truth. Jesus learned. Jesus knew. Okay, so let me get back on the story. I just smoked a joint, so you'll have to excuse me. So anyhow, Jesus gets to Samaria and he sits down. And it says, if you read John 4, it says he sits down at the well. Now this also is very significant. Jesus sits down in the dirt. Why? This is why I encourage everyone to read the word on your own. Study it on your own. Jesus sits down in the dirt because dirt represents humility. And that's how we are to meet people. If you are a Christian, you're not to walk around and acting like you're all pious and better than everyone else. Well, I never, or I don't anymore. No, you meet people. We are to. He who is too great, deems himself too great to serve, will never be great enough to lead, because it's in serving that we lead. And we are to get down, we're to meet people where they're at, because Christ came to love, not to judge. My point is, on this story, is the woman at the well. Now, this is a woman who had 5 husbands and was now living with a man who wasn't her husband. Now, we'd all be talking about her today, let alone back then. No, I've heard a lot of men do this, share about the woman at the well. Well, I got my own view of the woman at the well. Because like I said, it's easy to judge. It takes a little effort to love and to understand. Now, in those days, women were like cattle. They were, if a family had a daughter, she wasn't left any of the land or any inheritance when her father died. Women were just, we weren't deemed as important as men. We were just property. So if we couldn't produce and have children, we weren't all that important. Well, the woman at the well had a barren womb, yet she had 5 husbands. So you know what that tells me about the woman at the well? It tells me she must have been quite a looker. Because even though she had the reputation that she couldn't produce an heir, these men kept willing to be taking a chance with her. No, it doesn't say that she was a floozy. It says she had 5 husbands. And since she couldn't produce, since she had a barren womb, she would have been considered pretty well useless as a wife. Therefore, she was abandoned 5 times by men who had taken her in to be their wife. Now, back then, she couldn't go get a job at Target or something. So she had a couple of choices. I mean, it doesn't mention any family, so I doubt she had any. So The only job that she had back then is choices is, unless she had an offer of marriage, she could either be a prostitute or she could live with someone who wasn't her husband. And she chose the less of the two. As a result, everybody talked about her. Everybody gossiped. The women shunned her. And every time she'd go into town, they'd be whispering. You know how catty women can be, even in today. Imagine back then. So they're all always talking about her and catty. And, and plus, they love talking about her. It's just like us today. We love looking at the magazines, celebrities without makeup or something, And she was a very, outshined them in beauty. So they took a special delight in talking about her. So as a result, because of her shame and because of the way she was treated, people would go get to the well and get their water early in the day, when it was cooler. But the woman at the well, the Samaritan woman, she waited until the hottest part of the day, where she was sure everybody would be under the tent, under cover, to walk to get the water, just so that she didn't have to be seen and have to deal with being shunned and probably called names and just treated badly. So here she is, and she gets there. The woman of the well, a Samaritan woman, gets to the well, and there Jesus is, and he asks her for a drink. And she says, "You have nothing to draw with, sir." And she's surprised also. Okay, this is important. This is an important part. Number one, Jesus is Jewish. She's a Samaritan. So we're also dealing back then with racism, because Jews were, they considered Samaritans half-breeds. They didn't talk to them. Not only that, she was a woman. No self-respecting Jew was going to talk to a Samaritan woman, let alone a Samaritan woman who had 5 husbands. But here he was talking to her. So like I said, Jesus is sitting in the dirt, which represents humility, I forgot to point out. Jesus was traveling with his disciples, but what did he do with them? He sent them off into town to pick up groceries, to get something to eat. Now, did it take every one of them to go get the food? No. Jesus had an appointment with the woman at the well because he chose her above everyone in all the world to reveal his truth to first and to evangelize. Not a Pharisee, not a king or a queen, but the woman at the well. So Jesus sits down with her, and, they're talking, and he goes, "Go fetch your husband." And she says, "I haven't any husband." He says, "That's right. You've had 5 husbands, and now you're living with a man, not your husband." And he didn't say it condescendingly in a judgmental way, like that. He just said it, matter of factly, not judgmentally. And she's like, "Surely you are a prophet." And by the end of the conversation, this woman who was so terrified of the rest of the community, who hid in shame for so many years, run into town, and she says, "Oh, come meet a man who told me everything I've ever done. Surely I have met the Messiah. Come meet the Messiah." And so then the people in the community, they're like, "Wow, what's going on here?" And I suspect she was probably speaking to the men, because the women, I don't know. She could have been speaking to them too, but it doesn't matter. They all came to see for themselves. And then they believed that Jesus stayed there a couple of more days. And then she went off with him and became one of the disciples. Well, not the disciples, but a follower, which I guess is a disciple, because I'm a disciple. If you're a Christian and a follower, you're a disciple. But my point that I brought her up for was simply this. Don't you think she felt like giving up? I mean, who'd she have to talk to? He doesn't even say anything about this man she lived with. It doesn't say whether she had affections for him. Doesn't tell anything besides it wasn't her husband and he didn't have enough affections for her to marry her. But what it does say was don't sell yourself short. Don't discredit yourself. Because God gives his toughest battles to those that he has the highest calling for. And you can do it like when Paul was in, last thing I want to say here, when Paul was in prison, see, I think of this and this helps me. When Paul was in prison, it's like, because like I said, I have felt like giving up. I mean, my Lord, I even have a video from just a couple of months ago that I made because I was like, I got so depressed and the devil at my door trying to get me to do that, you know? But you know what? Then I think of Paul, who wrote most of the Bible. I mean, more books in the Bible than anyone. And when he was in prison, I mean, this is like a little I'm sorry, I'm only 5'1", so this is a little 4-foot prison. So, you know, he's probably all hunched over and stuff. They only gave him enough food to keep him alive, not enough to put any meat on their bones, just enough food and water to keep you alive, beat you every single day. And what did he say? I can endure all things through Christ who strengthens me. So, please, you're not alone. If you're at that point right now, as you're watching this, I'm going to ask you. Oh, sorry. I'm sitting down. I'm going to ask you to trust God and to talk to him or to talk to someone. Call a friend. Go visit a neighbor. You know, the best thing that I can ever find when I'm depressed to lift me up is go to help someone else. There's nothing that helps me more. Not a drug. The greatest thing I can find, I mean, of course, God, but God is in everyone. So if you're depressed, if you're down, go find somebody to help. Go find somebody to love. Not physically, but, you know, like take a homeless person a meal. Go visit an elderly person and listen to their stories. Go throw a ball with a neighbor's kid. Pick up a candy bar for your neighbor that lives next door and never gets out because, you know, they love candy. You know, just, I know to help, the best thing that helps me is when I get out of me. All right. I had, like I said, I had no clue what I was going to say. I probably, you know, I get nervous. So I want to do smoke and talk, but then, I don't know. Maybe I'll just, maybe I'll share, because I don't know if anybody's on, but maybe I'll share a little bit of my book. Okay. Let's see. It says, it's called Nobody's Daughter. Raised in a house of shame, hated for her very existence by those entrusted to care for her. At 15, she exchanged her life for a ring and spent the next 12 years a prisoner. Leaving him would be the beginning of her journey, yet not her life lessons. Yet not her life lessons. The journey had just begun. The story starts in a fishing community on an island off the coast of Maine and ends in Los Angeles. From Maine to Beverly Hills to living with the Crips in Los Angeles, where her reputation for feeding the homeless, ministering to incarcerated youth, sharing Christ openly in word and deed, earned her the name Sister Grace, one woman's journey from hell to hope to spiritual prosperity. 6 weeks after she'd relocated from her little island off the coast of Maine to Beverly Hills, Karen, a pretty petite late 40s woman child who emanated youth, passion, friendliness, and passion for life, who usually wore a warm, inviting smile to hide yesterday's pain and possessed an easy, contagious laugh, woke up alone and emotionally broken in the psychiatric unit of UCLA Hospital in Los Angeles after a failed suicide attempt. Karen's nurse, a tall, thin, mid-20s woman with fine chestnut brown hair pulled back with a neon green scrunchie with a single loose braid, with piercing blue-gray eyes and a smile that matched her disposition, warm, friendly, and caring, informed Karen that they'd pumped her stomach the night before and that she would be there for at least the next 72 hours. Softly, barely above a whisper, the nurse, looking at her with eyes full of empathy and compassion, said, "I'm glad you're still with us, Karen." As Karen listened attentively to what the kind nurse was saying, she wept with the intensity of an abandoned child without hope. Gently, the nurse, with her voice filled with compassion, explained the ER doctor had spoken to Karen's daughter, Farah, who had called the police after Karen had called to say goodbye, that she just couldn't do this life anymore. Making little sense, crying hysterically, her words almost illegible. Continued, "Danny lied," she cried, her words slurred from the bottle of wine she'd drunk and the 90 Valium she'd taken. Anxious, terrified her mother was going to die at her own hands, feeling powerless to do anything to save her, Farah, a tall, fiery redhead who physically resembled Gwyneth Paltrow and who had always been an old head on young shoulders, asked to speak to Danny, her mother's boyfriend, a much older, gray-haired, clinically diagnosed narcissistic Jewish law professor who screamed like a crazed man and refused to get on the phone. Farah had warned her mother before she relocated from Vinyl Haven, a small island of 1,100 residents on the coast of Maine, to Beverly Hills, that her relationship with Danny wouldn't work. First of all, anyone who had spent 5 minutes with Karen knew that her first and most important relationship in her life was the one that she had with God. And Danny, who had grown up pampered and privileged, wasn't a believer. Danny had often accused that God was Karen's crutch because she had grown up alone and unloved. Now she had him. Danny would say confidently, she no longer needed God. Yet Karen was convinced that Danny was from God, her reward for staying pure, for waiting till marriage to consummate their relationship. From the beginning, Farah had cautioned her mother, "You're so naive, Mom. He's not going to wait." "Yes, he is," Karen would vehemently reply, convinced that God alone had brought Danny into her life. The part of the story that Danny wasn't aware of was that while on a trip, the part of the story Farah wasn't aware of was that while on a trip, Karen had suffered from a severe allergic reaction to some food she'd eaten at a French restaurant on one of their honeymoons, as Danny would call them. Danny had given Karen medication that made her disoriented, unable to walk, talk, or function. Before Karen knew what was happening, she was passed out on the bed. Hours later, she woke up naked on top of Danny, his penis inside of her, in the middle of a vigorous sexual encounter. Upon realizing what was happening, Karen immediately jumped off Danny, crossed her legs and arms, attempting to cover her nakedness, as well as her shame, while trembling and crying uncontrollably, the hair around her face wet with tears. "Not again, not again," she uttered aloud, as if in disbelief, shaking her head, her eyes swollen and red, her face stained with tears, not realizing her words were audible, feeling like she'd just been raped, yet confused. After all, she loved Danny and was planning on marrying him. Rape, how could it be rape? Danny was a Rhodes Scholar. Her, nobody's daughter. Why couldn't she just stop crying like Danny ordered? She questioned her sanity, her judgment. After all, he wasn't violent. He hadn't beaten her first. Again, Danny screamed accusingly. What's wrong with you? As Karen wept uncontrollably, appearing more like a shattered child than a woman. She moved to the other side of the room, her already tiny frame curled up in a fetal position, and the black leather hotel chair making her appear no bigger than a 12-year-old child. With a look of disgust and arrogance, Danny accused, "You act like someone died. It's only sex." "It was supposed to be my choice," she choked out, almost apologetically. Through tears, her head swirling. Before Karen was old enough to tie her shoes, she'd been sexually abused and passed around like a bag of chips by those who should have loved and protected her most, leaving her oblivious to the fact that her body was her own and that she had a choice in who touched her. As a young teen, she had worn tampons, even when not menstruating, to deter men from using her body for their own pleasure. She had a choice. She wanted to honor God, to wait till marriage. She replied with tears so heavy her words barely legible. "It was supposed to be my choice this time," she said it, as though she hadn't heard herself the prior 3 or 4 times. "There's something wrong with you," he accused almost violently. "You're a grown woman with kids and grandmother. You shouldn't be acting like this. You're supposed to love me. Something's wrong with you. Seriously wrong with you," he continued, his voice angry, accusing, as she sat in the expensive hotel chair, her face buried and her hands shaking, crying uncontrollably. At the other times when he'd had a choice, all the other times that she hadn't had a choice flooded her mind and heart with shame and remorse. "There's something seriously wrong with you," he reiterated. "You shouldn't be this upset. I thought I heard you moaning in your sleep. So I thought you wanted it, and it was okay. My ex-wife used to do that. It's not a big deal. It's not like you're a virgin. I could see if you were a 15-year-old kid, but you're almost 50. This is ridiculous, you carrying on like this. Pull yourself together so we can get something to eat. I know you don't do it on purpose, but you have this energy, a sexual energy that drives men wild. Maybe that's why your father raped you, because you drove him crazy. You didn't mean to. It's just something you have, an energy about you that make men crazy sexually. You really need to pull it together. You acting like this gives me serious concerns about marriage." Karen, being a survivor of incest, had spent her life believing she was born bad and blamed herself for both Danny's actions and her response. After all, Danny was an Oxford educated, was a Rhodes Scholar, went to Harvard, had a PhD, had traveled the world. She had barely finished the 8th grade, was a wife and mother while still a teenager, had no family outside of her kids. All she knew about was God and faith. She was convinced, any fool could see, Danny was better than her. Even her mother, who had given her away as an infant, warned her, men like Danny didn't want women like her. Girls like you with no education or money are snuck through the back door, her mother said, with an undeniable hint of pleasure in her voice. You'll never be accepted by his friends or family, her mother cautioned. Don't be stupid. You're a plaything, nothing more, her mother warned. He likes the way you look on his arm, but you're no spring chicken either. We all lose our looks. Having not been touched in years by a man, Karen, making the choice of celibacy years before had resulted in Karen having to seek medical attention after Danny raped her, as being celibate for so many years resulted in her getting honeymoon vagina, a medical term more common in the 30s, almost unheard of in the modern world. Simply put, she was irritated down there. It was through heavy tears. Had broken down and told her mentor, Betsy. Oh, sorry. It was painful as though she'd been a virgin. Karen confided to her therapist, Carolia, her minister, and through heavy tears had broken down and told her mentor, Betsy, an older gray-haired woman with severe scoliosis who stood just under 5 feet and she attended church with and greatly admired. And though Karen had always been open with her children, perhaps too open at times, feeling ashamed once again, believing it was her fault that she had been raped. Believing it was her fault she had kept the rape from her kids, convinced because Danny had a PhD, he was incapable of rape, unless that he'd said she made him do it because of the evil that lurked inside of her. Sorry. She was born bad, or so she believed. Farah had no idea just how toxic her mother's relationship was with Danny, who they knew little about him. Without warning, the phone went dead. Farah had always been quick on her feet, called the Beverly Hills police, traced her mother's phone, and saved her life. As if comforting herself, the nurse, who name-tagged read Jenny with an I, licked her lips and wiped her slightly trembling hands across her freshly pressed Winnie the Pooh nurse's top, as if smoothing out her imaginary wrinkles, softly, barely above a whisper. The nurse, Jenny, looking at her with eyes full of empathy and compassion and hints of a Midwestern accent, said, "I'm glad you're still with us, Karen." Gently leaning in towards her, Karen, dropping her voice barely above a whisper, the young yet experienced nurse who smelled of butterscotch from the Werther's hard candy she was known to carry in her pockets, laying her hand gently on Karen's slender shoulder, saying, "Maybe you should take the next 72 hours to reflect on how you got to this point, as to never to returning to it, appearing more like a frightened child than a woman." All right, I've got a lot more, but I'm going to stop there. The last thing I'm going to say, if you're there. Oh, my phone's ringing. I hear it. Wait a sec. Hold on a sec. Then, sorry, my phone was up. Take the next 72 hours to reflect on how you got to this point. Because that's what I did, and I wrote a book about it. God bless you all. Hey, girl.
Hey, okay, so I've had good and I've had bad.
Good and bad what?